I was wondering if you could just help us understand what a living wage is and how they're determined and how this differs from what we also hear about often, which is a minimum wage.
Yeah, of course. I think this is again a very interesting question because I think originally a minimum wage was actually supposed to be a living wage. If you look at very
Mm.
early references to what defines a minimum wage, for example, in the first ILO documents referring to a minimum wage, that definition seems very, yeah, pretty much the same as what we as Clean
Right.
Clothes Campaign currently define as a living wage, which is a wage
Mm.
that is enough to cover basic needs for a worker and their dependents, and it should be earned within a standard working week. At CCC, we
Hmm.
always add that a standard working week should not be more than 48 hours.
Yeah.
And I think there's also, in general, agreement about what basic needs are. So, housing, food, enough money to pay for school fees or medical fees, some money to buy clothes
Mm.
or other necessities, and then, of course, some money to pay for transportation, or nowadays also, I think communication should be in there, and then a small amount to keep for savings. Um, so that's what a living wage is. But I think originally a minimum wage was supposed uh,
Right.
to be that. And yeah, I think the best way to determine what a living wage is for garment workers should first of all always involve garment workers. So any study or research
Mm.
into how much does a garment worker need in this place or in that place, I think there's no way to understand what a worker needs if you don't involve them in this process.
Hmm.
So CCC recently actually worked on its own estimation for European production countries for what a living wage should be in those countries, and we used the Asia Floor Wage Alliance methodology for that. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's maybe a little bit technical, but I'll start and then just stop me if it gets too boring or too dry.
Okay,
But for
perfect.
this methodology, we usually start by doing food basket research. So basically, yeah,
Okay.
literally going to the market and buy uh, what you would buy if you were to have like a nutritious diet, and then see how much
Hmm.
you spend um, for one person plus their dependents. So then after
Hmm.
that, you have to determine what percentage of the household's income is spent on food. And there is a whole theory about this. It's called Engel's Law. And that says
Hmm.
that usually in lower income countries, this percentage is higher. So yeah, maybe you can
Right.
imagine that a very poor family would spend maybe up to 50 or 60% of their income on food. So that means that they have, yeah,
Mm.
only 50 or 40% left to spend on other things. And the higher the
Hmm.
household income is, the lower that this percentage will get. So as soon as you
Okay.
determine that percentage, then you can, based on the food basket, determine how much 100% would be. And then that would be your living wage. Um, but
Hmm.
now I went a bit quickly. But of course, there are also some political choices that you have to make in such a calculation. For example, we argue that a living wage is never an individual wage. It's not a wage for one person,
Mm.
but a family wage or yeah, a wage for a worker and their
Right.
dependents. And another choice that you have to make very early on if you want to start calculating how much a living wage is, again, is a little bit technical and maybe seems a bit funny, is how many calories a worker needs to perform their job. Because this has quite big implications for the food basket. And since the food basket is the starting point for the whole calculation, it's actually quite important. So, for example, if you imagine that a specific
Mm.
diet costs $100, if we count on 2,200 calories per day per person, but it might cost 130 if we count on 3,000 calories per person. This adds up quite quickly,
Right.
of course, if it's multiplied by 30 days. So these are, yeah, some of the choices that you have to make if you want to estimate what a living wage is. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
That was really interesting, and I liked how you explained the breakdown because I think understanding how living wages are trying to be quite a holistic measure of what, the type of wage necessary to live a good life is really interesting when you hear what is taken into account in that. And I love what you said about it's really important for garment workers to be involved in that process, because at the end of the day, they're the only ones who are going to know how much they need to be able to provide for themselves and their families and dependents um, in a sustainable way. So
Yeah,
I really like how you broke it down.
yeah. I think what is tricky, actually, for myself, coming from a European country, a Western European country, I think a lot of us there think about minimum wages still in that old way, right? The way that it was
Hmm.
originally meant. And I think for garment brands, often coming from those same countries, I think they regard minimum wages mostly as a legal requirement. So for them, it's all about
Okay.
abiding by national laws, which means that paying the legally
Mm,
mandated minimum wage is enough. They're not violating any laws, they're
right.
not breaking any rules. So that's also why very often you'll see that in brand sustainability reports or other publications that they put out, they will report quite proudly about the fact that they've paid 100% of their workforce the local minimum wage, which completely, they seem to be
Yeah.
forgetting or ignoring that the minimum wage in those countries have been kept at poverty level, basically only to attract
Right.
their investment. So I think that's really tricky, and therefore it's really important that people understand the difference between a minimum wage, and especially what a minimum wage might be in your country, where a minimum
Hmm.
wage might actually be at the living wage level. But in most garment production countries, if there is a minimum wage, it's not at living wage level. So I think that's really important to realize.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that that context is so important for brands to look into, because it differs so much from country to country. And even like you were explaining about the food basket, food costs and costs of living differ so much from place to place. So really wanting to, take the time to understand those differences is such a key part in this process. And yeah, I love how you explained that. I think that there is so much around brands trying to avoid these conversations and topics and just trying to scrape by with the minimum requirements, like you were saying with the law. And that's probably another really great reason why, advocating for living wages to be incorporated in legislation, as we'll talk a bit about later, is really important at this stage. So yeah, I think that one thing I wanted to touch on, as on this topic of brands avoiding responsibility to an extent, is this complex use of subcontracting agreements that often obscures responsibility and helps brands to, in a way, avoid taking responsibility for paying living wages. And I was just wondering if you could share a bit about how these complexities make it easier for brands to avoid taking responsibility, and then whose responsibility should it be to ensure that living wages are paid?
Yes, I think you're right that subcontracting indeed is, yeah, a very big issue in the industry, probably also in other industries. And this issue is, of course, very much related to the lack of transparency in the supply chain. So
Mm,
that means that us as consumers are not really able to know for sure where the products that we buy in the shop, where they've been made, by whom, how much these people were paid, all of that.
mhm,
I'm really not an expert on subcontracting issues, but basically it comes down to the fact that when a brand places an order, it sometimes is not produced by the supplier that the brand has a contract with, but sometimes by a factory that
right.
is owned by the same company, or it might be that this other factory is owned by a family member of the original supplier. So it's very,
Mm,
yeah, illegal and behind the scenes. And um, oftentimes these factories, so these subcontracting factories, they don't
yeah,
always have an export license. So that means that, for example, they also won't be audited by like these big auditing firms. And I also really
right.
don't mean to suggest that audits of exporting factories happen in a very good way or give a very realistic view of what's happening in that
Yeah,
factory, especially if you think about Ali Enterprise, for example, a factory in Pakistan that
Mm.
burned down completely to the ground, and that factory was audited just a few days before that happened. So I'm not saying that
Right.
auditing is the best, but what we hear from our partners, so unions on the ground in production countries, is that subcontractor factories, yeah, what's happening there is just really not okay. So these
Mm.
factories, these subcontracting factories, often do not appear on supplier lists that brands publish, and workers who work in these factories often do not know what brands they are producing for. Um, and also, subcontracting is often not visible on shipping information that we can find. So, there it will simply say, because there we have the contract information, so there it will
Yeah.
simply say that an order came from the factory where the brand placed the order. So, yeah, it's very hard to
Mm.
detect, and that's why this still remains one of the biggest issues in the supply chain, because also brands do not
Mm.
always know for sure if an order was actually made in the factory where they thought they placed the order. Um, at
Yeah.
the same time, Clean Clothes Campaign um, thinks it's still unfair of brands to blame suppliers for low wages.
Mhm.
I think I said that earlier during this interview, that brands really have pushed the price of production so low that suppliers can really not afford to pay workers a living wage, because brands
Mm.
will only choose suppliers that commit to really fast and really low pricing, which places a lot of pressure, of course,
Mhm.
on working conditions. And since brands are on top of the supply chain, they should ensure that they pay their suppliers enough to enable them to pay living
Yes.
wages to their workers. So I think a very good first step for brands would be to really understand how much more they would need to pay in order to make this possible. So then again, we go back to pricing that we talked about earlier. A brand should really understand how much time does it take to produce one piece of this product that I'm ordering, and then
Mhm.
how large is my order, so how many minutes in total are needed to make this order, and then see how much is a living wage, um, so that you can determine what 1 minute of labor would cost, and then make sure that
Yes.
you pay this price to your supplier, so the supplier can pay uh, workers a living wage. This is really, yeah, the
Right.
responsibility of brands. Also, if you think about the fact that brands are producing and selling more clothes than ever. Like this number is still increasing year after
Mm.
year, and are making huge profits even during the pandemic. Um, I think, yeah, there's absolutely no one else responsible for paying workers a living wage.
Right.
Yeah.